Next, we have Chaplain Kenneth Bush, and he's going to be addressing the issue Caring and Complexity, the U.S. Army Chaplain Center and School.
Actually, I think they changed the title to Building Resilience, but it's related in soldiers and families and caregivers, so it's providential that I'm following Elizabeth to talk a little bit about the other side of that. But before I continue on with my remarks, I just want to thank Roz and Lucas again for hosting this conference and extending an invitation to me to come. And just to remind the audience that Harvard and the institution that I serve have a historical connection. Back during the Second World War, the United States Army Chaplain Center and School was just down the street here at Adolphus Bush Hall for a period of time during the Second World War. And so chaplains were being trained here to be sent out to different theaters around the world. Because of our mission, the Army recognizes that the most important element of the formations that we have are not the weapons that we have or the material things that we have, but our soldiers. I think I've seen that even more emphasized in the 30 years that I've served in the military community and in the years before that when I was a military dependent and watched my father as he came up through the military. This often, see if I can get this thing to work. Yeah, there it is. Oops, go back one. Yeah, it's not just the Marines, the Army too. This often quoted statement from General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army during the Second World War, and Secretary of State later, and the author of the Marshall Plan, reminds us of what we now kind of refer to in military circles as the human dimension of what we do. And that, in fact, I just came back last week. At this time, I was involved in a conference up at West Point, their biannual global leadership conference, and the topic was the human dimension. We had academics and researchers and chaplains and behavioral science folks from the military academy and other schools there to talk about this whole concept of human dimension, and even more specifically, the whole concept of building resilience. You know, we talk a lot about what happens when soldiers come back, and the family members who have to deal with the soldiers when they come back. But now we need to talk more about resilience. Is it possible, and how do you build resilience into folks before they deploy? We know that some people deploy and they have experiences and they come through it and they actually are stronger at the other end than when they came in to those experiences. Others deploy and come back and they have a much more difficult time dealing with the things that they've seen. And there's lots of different reasons for that, both sociologically, psychologically, spiritually, and otherwise. So the Army's kind of started several initiatives that they're looking at. They haven't been completely fielded. They're still in the kind of developmental stages, but a lot of people around the Army are talking about the whole concept of building resilience. There's the Training and Doctrine Command has a cell of folks talking about the human dimension. There's Brigadier General Rhonda Cornum has been tasked by the Chief of Staff of the Army. She's put together an interdisciplinary team of people to look at, can we measure resilience and building resilience in the soldiers? Can we kind of look at them very early on in their careers and then follow them through the rest of their time in areas like family resilience and spiritual resilience and emotional resilience? We already do the physical resilience part pretty well. So can we do it in these other ways, in these other areas, and then measure them? And I'm just going to run down a couple programs that are out there in ways in which the chaplaincy is involved, the Army chaplaincy is involved, and I know their sister services in many ways are involved in some of the similar things. In terms of relational resilience, the United States Army is involved in a program called Strong Bonds. It's a chaplain-led, unit-based program. Started out with in 1999 with about just a handful of couples in the 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii, and has now grown to about a $30 million funded program with 100,000 people who have participated in 2,500 events in that short time. And it's got several components. It has a single soldier component to help single soldiers to engage in developing solid relationships and when they pick a partner, what to look for. And then we have a couple component, a family component, and there's a pre and post deployment component that Elizabeth kind of alluded to. There are things that are done before they go to theater and after they come back, that we do kind of help build resilience, talk about issues, and deal with those things. And caregivers aren't immune from that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I mean, I have the same issues with chaplains who come to my chaplain center in school after having been downrange for a deployment. They come to their career course there as senior captains and majors. 100% of the class that's currently in-house have been deployed within the last year. And many of them suffer some of the same kinds of stressors that their soldiers do. We skip back one more. Okay. Then there's emotional and mental resilience. We have a thing called battle mind training. It's something the Army does, and it's not just chaplains who do that, but chaplains have a big component of that. It's looking at how do you strengthen a soldier's mind before, during, and after conflict. The Army Suicide Prevention Program, as many of you know, that has been a concern in the Army in the last couple of months. There's been some articles many of you have read about some of the issues of suicide. And then warrior transition units. Those are the units that help soldiers transition, especially wounded warriors, transition back into the military or into civilian life. We have chaplains that are involved in all of those organizations to help them deal with the spiritual dimension primarily, although not exclusively. Moral resilience. We've talked a little bit about the ethics component. Chaplains are mandated to be involved in moral leadership training. We do that at all levels throughout the Army. And I know our sister services do much of the same thing. We have service school ethics instructors in the Army. That's something in our structure that Chaplain Wester mentioned. We have them at West Point. We have them at the NDU. We have them at the Army Command General Staff College, where I was on the staffing faculty for 3 years, at the War College and other places. And all the service schools have instructors. Spiritual resilience, that's kind of our stock and trade as chaplains. We're concerned and focused on how do we build resilient soldiers and family members in terms of that spiritual dimension of life? And that's an area that's our domain to deal with, and how you do that in a pluralistic environment. But we talk about things that everybody normally thinks of: worship and the rites and sacraments and ordinances that create the spiritual communities and faith communities of which our soldiers come from, and also spiritual formation. How do they grow and develop spiritually? The generation of young folks coming behind generations that have, between me and them are much more attuned to spirituality. They maybe don't define it the same way that people in my generation define it, but they talk about it, and they have concerns about those issues. Actually, I think that when we get resistance about talking about spirituality, we more often get it from people from my generation in academics or in others because of sensitive issues. But my children and many of their counterparts, peers, are pretty open about talking about spirituality in different ways than maybe we have. Now, how about resilient caregivers? Well, at the Chaplain Center and School, we've done a couple things to try to help our chaplains who have also experienced the traumas of war to come back and reintegrate. We make them think about things like a theology of suffering and evil. Now you think, gee, they're all seminary graduates, they're all theology students before they came to us, have been ordained. Many of them had, we require most of them to have at least 2 years of experience of some kind before they come on active duty. Wouldn't they have got this down before they came to us? No. You'd be surprised how many times that's not true. And in the basic course, we require them now to write a little paper about their own theology of suffering and evil, and a lot of them come and say, we never had to think about this in seminary. And so when I get calls from some seminary professors, I remind them that one of the things they can do for their chaplain candidates that are going through the program is to make them do something on the whole theology of suffering and evil from the traditions from which they come. We do the Strong Bonds retreats for our own chaplains, for their families as well. We talk about spiritual formation with them, require them to think about their traditions, because when you get busy and you see a lot of things going on, sometimes you don't do the things that you tell other people to do. And that includes build up your own spiritual life and faith tradition. We hold a spouses seminar for all the spouses. It's voluntary, but we have many of them come. For our basic course students, those that first class that they have before they come into the military chaplaincy, we invite the spouses to come, and we have them talk to several of the agencies that are out there, helping agencies for them, but also have them talk to spouses of current officers or chaplains that are serving, and to find out what it is like to move every 3 years or less, and what it's like to be back home when their spouse is deployed, And when I say spouse, I mean both husbands and wives, because we have both in today's military. Our current chief of the Army Chaplaincy has set up a Center for Spiritual Leadership, which the primary focus of that center is inward to the Chaplain's Corps. He feels that there's a great need for us to be spiritually resilient, because he can't minister to soldiers and families when you're not spiritually resilient yourself. He wants to give back to the civilian parishes, synagogues, and mosques that send their chaplains into the Army for whatever period of time. He wants to give back to them at the end of that tour men and women who are spiritually strong or stronger than when they came in, and are able to deal with the things that they've seen and help others to deal with those things. And so they're tasked to do some retreats for chaplains, chaplain assistants. And they've done several of those. They do 2 a year right now. And then they're trying to also build networks of opportunities for chaplain assistants to go out and do some spiritual retreat time. I have my boss and the people that I work with, we've authorized our chaplains who are in our 6-month course. We authorize them to take time off of the training if they can find a spiritual retreat either from their denomination or tradition, or they can show us that they're going to be able to use that time off in a way to help them grow spiritually. We'll give them, a weekend, a 4-day extended weekend to do that during their time at the school, because we feel it's important for them to get reconnected to their own faith. And then every year we have a thing called CAST, the Chaplaincy Area Sustainment Training. This year's CAST theme is Renewing the Soldier's Mind. Our whole focus is going to be talking about how do you renew the minds of soldiers and their family members. And some of it has to do with issues like worldview, and how do you help shape that? How do you help change worldviews or reconnect people to the worldviews, their basic values? As has been mentioned here, we get our soldiers in, our chaplains, chaplain assistants, soldiers, and families, most of them from 18 to 25-year-old age range. If you know anything about that age, you'll know that's when most people are trying to figure out for themselves finally what they believe. In many different areas. It's like they have a knapsack on their back, and they have it full of things, and they pull it out and they take it out and look at it and say, I got that from my church. Okay, I may keep this one, or maybe not. Or they take things from their family and say, yeah, that's a value I hold. My family taught me that, and I believe that, and then they put it back in their rucksack. And so in this time frame, here at the university, and when we get them either as enlisted soldiers or officers, they're in that searching time frame, and they're experiencing many of these things in a time of their life when they're trying to make some of those decisions about what they believe and what they hold central to their system of belief and values. We all have a role in that, and just like to end with that, this encourages and challenges to think about then, not just the question of what we do when they come back and they've got some issues, but are there things that we can do to help them before they go or while they're there to build that resilience in their lives? Thanks.
Thank you. And our last presenter is Chaplain Brian Simpson, and he's going to be talking about the Warrior Transition Program.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. Shall we go 3 for 3? I didn't even touch it. This may seem a little schizophrenic in a way, and it ought to. The reason I put it up there that way is largely because even though the Marine Corps, as you see, the emblem says Department of the Navy, and they often refer to it, yes, the men's department. We're supposed to be part kind of joined at the hip. Not really. There are so many differences between the two, service and practice, not just in terms of tactics and training, but in so many other things, mindset and the like, that this is going to be it'll be a good one, but you'll learn some things, hopefully, and appreciate some of the vagaries and the differences. We've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. We've been doing the transition back from deployment for over 20 years. We've been doing pre-deployment seminars for families for about the same amount of time. We do it for the Marines. The Marines do it. The Navy does it. And it's been a constant struggle, really. It's strange, but from the beginning, when I first came in, getting families to show up for the pre-deployment training and fairs where we introduce them to all the support services, and we talk about all the different possibilities of what may be ensuing during the deployment, because now these folks who have been relying on this partner to be home to take care of the kids, do the cooking, the cleaning, be there for if the washing machine breaks or the car, whatever, are now by themselves. And they have the checkbook too, and that's the first half of the puzzle. Second half is this warrior or wannabe warrior, if it's not a wartime, if it's peacetime, this wannabe warrior comes back from this exciting jaunt across the sea, and it's, wait a minute, he hasn't, or she hasn't had the checkbook for 6 months, hasn't had to worry about kids or anything else for 6 months. Now they have to reintegrate, and if they were used to being the person in charge of the household when they get back, how does that happen? So we spend a week, the last week of the deployment generally, as we're coming back from Hawaii or wherever, talking to Marines and sailors about what it means to go back home and how you reintegrate. And what if, oh, by the way, while you were gone, you had a child? What if you left a pregnant spouse behind? So there's so many different issues. So it wasn't that this was a great surprise or something new, but we quickly realized that this was not what was necessary. We needed a really formal process of bringing warriors back, not just deploying service members. And we went through the process of studying a lot of the literature that was out there. And there was a lot of good, solid Army research about what happens to soldiers in combat and how long they can stay in combat without being seriously affected. And we took that seriously, and we built a program. And the program we built also, I like to refer to in kind of Hawaiian terms as, it was a talk story program. What that meant was we gathered them together, and because in our day and age, people come and go to the battle site like overnight practically. You get on an airplane wherever, you're in the combat zone within 36 hours, you might even be in combat 24 hours later. And then, oh, by the way, it happens the same way in reverse. No time to process. So we set up these formal processing procedures, really. And the Marine Corps, that was designed really to be done at the platoon level or below. In some cases it was, in other cases sometimes it was larger groups, sometimes chaplains led them, and sometimes they were done in other ways. But that's essentially what the game plan was. And we used different methods, and we got from Mark 1 Mod 0 to Mod 3 to Mod 5. And I was happy when I went back the second time that the folks who were there and had modified the program left us with stuff because the people that came back with me hadn't been there for a long time. Some of them hadn't. But there was one particular squadron that I welcomed back as I was leaving, and they were on their fifth tour. And I had said hello, goodbye to them at like 3 of those times, because they were 7-month tours for them, and I was only there for a year the second time. But one of the problems was it was not designed for the wounded. It was not designed for people with TBI or anything else. It was designed for folks who were ambulatory and physically okay. So we obviously had to also concern ourselves with the other part. It was never designed for multiple deployments into combat zones. There was no concrete follow-up, and there was no way to evaluate it. We did, however, have a wonderful thing called the PDHRA, which was the Post-Deployment Health Assessment or Reassessment. And that every returning service member was supposed to fill out. And the second time around, it included a little bit of mental health stuff like, would you like to see a chaplain? Would you like to see a mental health professional? That's as far as we got on that. Didn't get any further, really, until there were a number of conferences that took place beginning really in 2007, or actually before that, the ball started rolling. There was a chaplain who worked with me who had been assigned to Altacadam, and he had developed a tracking program with a questionnaire to monitor everybody in his squadron so that he could tell when they were having unusual issues. And every now and then he'd pull somebody aside and have a chat with them, and he could tell the commanding officer in a very short period of time what the status of his command was. And he was one of the presenters at one of these conferences. And it was a mixture of mental health professionals, social workers, and chaplains. And it was a real step forward because the feedback led to everybody kind of going back to the drawing board, but not separately. Finally, everybody was going back to the drawing board together. So what we have now is what we call combat operational stress control. It's an interdisciplinary approach with medical, social service personnel, religious, mental health, and command involvement. Everybody has a piece of this, and everybody's involved in it. And it involves all kinds of aspects of military life, because it's not only interdisciplinary, it's also multiple approaches. There is new combat training involved. There are new elements included into the combat training to create the emotional resiliency, the mental resiliency to help the troops contend with the stress, especially when they're going back to the combat zone for a second, third time. Command leadership has very particular roles in this now. And there's a handbook, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The family support system with Marine Community Services and the Navy Family Service, Fleet and Family Service centers have really ramped up to try to take care of providing more support to families, and there's much more of a concern and a proactive approach at monitoring the Marines and the sailors at the 30-day, 60-day, 90-day mark. We discovered a long time ago that things can be quiet for the first 30 days. That's a fairly easy time. There's still that afterglow, but it begins to wear off, and then the symptoms of any kinds of issues begin to rear their ugly head around 90 days and beyond, and that's when you start seeing all kinds of maladaptive behavior and misbehavior. This is kind of what it looks like on the Marine Corps side. This combat operational stress, this was the centerpiece of a professional development training program we did last year. What the Army calls CAST, after fashion, we call PDTCs, or Professional Development Training Courses. And they're an annual event. There's a new model that you heard Dr. French earlier refer to being a SME. The Navy puts out contracts, develops plans, and hires professionals to evaluate what we're doing, and we take them places so that they get a sense of what's going on. We put them on ships, we take them out to marine places where 29 Palms or Camp Pendleton or Camp Lejeune, wherever, to give them a real concrete connection with the people that they are going to have to understand so that they can teach us chaplains what to do about it. The one on the far right is this year's professional development training theme, and it's combat and operational stress information for families and friends. The mid part is a program that the Marines have designed, and it's called the Leader's Guide. And the point is how to take care of Marines under stress. And this is where the command piece from the Marine Corps really comes in. And it's one of those things which really kind of indicates the difference between the Marine Corps and the Navy. The Marine Corps has gotten into this very largely because theirs are the folks who have the boots on the ground for the most part. On the Navy side, we have CBs, and a lot of those, and if you ever saw some of those old World War II movies, John Wayne's big CB, those guys build and fight. That's what they do. They're a combat construction battalion. And we've had several reserve units come over to the desert and spend considerable amount of time. So it's not just active duty. And some of your folks are some of those reservists, and we've had them from all over the country. One of the sad things that happened when I was there was a reserve unit out of the Midwest, and shortly after they arrived there was two of them were killed by an IED in a Humvee, and one was the corpsman, and she was a single mother, and she left a 16-year-old daughter behind. You know, so we talk about a lot of tragedy that's attached to this. So one of the things is, how does her family deal with it? The Navy's version of the Wounded Warrior thing is called the Safe Harbor Program. This is non-medical continuing care for the sailor and their family. And it's not just combat wounds, because unless they're a CB or a SEAL, they probably haven't seen that. There are a few individual augmentees that get involved and get sent over there, but not very many compared to the large number of Marines and soldiers. So the Safe Harbor Program is designed for sailors who are injured on the job, those few who do have combat wounds, and those who suffer off the job, off-duty injuries. And we've had a whole slew of motorcycle deaths and injuries since. It's not integrated as a piece so much as it's kind of farmed out to the Fleet and Family Service Centers and the like. The Marine Corps, on the other hand, I wish that had translated better in the picture, that's the Wounded Warrior Regiment. it is a formal Marine Corps command. It's not just a cobbled together ad hoc organization. They do have the standard Marine Corps structure, including an assigned chaplain. And the first commanding officer and chaplain were literally handpicked for this job. And one of the great discoveries in the process of reintegrating the wounded warrior was taught by them. And that was when they get together, they do very well together. And so I'm going to fly through the West. This is from the PDTC, and talks about the spiritual side. And there's a lot that we learned about the moral injury, not just the physical injury and the mental injury, about how to comfort for the bereaved, talking points that were given, because sometimes the boilerplate religious answer doesn't fit and doesn't help. The connectedness is very, very critical in keeping people connected. You know, one of the issues when they do come back is they've been disconnected. And especially for reservists in that, it's a real problem. The Navy started having meetings in hotels to get people together to deal with this. These are the forms of social support that are important. And you see, spiritual support actually did make the list. One of the problems we have is this tension between religion and science. There hasn't been a lot of good studies about the religious impact in trauma, and from protecting or from the healing. And some of the studies were done 15 years ago really weren't scientific. So we're trying to get into that. Most people, when they have a problem, will see a chaplain rather than a mental health professional. So we're really critical to this whole process. Now, someone brought up this morning the whole issue of spirituality and religion, and they're not the same as this slide portrays. Religion is considered, for our purposes, spirituality frequently ignored. It's if I get the right page, we'll be fine. It has to do with an experience of faith that is not necessarily connected to a formal practice, and that is, it's almost in line with the Unitarian Universalist approach. It's a lot less clearly defined and articulated, but religion is the formal practice. Now, they do overlap, but not in all people. You have some folks who are very religious but not very spiritual, and some folks who are extremely spiritual, not very religious. And then this is the cerebral biological therapeutic model of spirituality and how all of these things fit together, the emotions, the spiritual impact in thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. This will give you an idea how much research is done in religion and mental health. It's not much. Look at that. 3% in psychology, 1%, less than 1% in medical journals. So you can see there's a need to take care of that. Problems are the way that the whole process is done. It's not done very clinically, and it needs to be worked out. Moral injury I talked about. This is one of the important parts of why chaplains are necessary to the healing process. Red flags. There are like 4 red flags when it comes to spiritual injury. One is the loss of faith, because some folks really do suffer that because their faith has not been that strong or their spirituality is not that well developed. And it's characterized by questions expressing chronic, strong anger at God. Everybody gets mad at God when something happens like this, but theirs just lingers and grows, and they have a hard time just letting go of it. There's guilt is another one, survivor guilt among other things, what they did, what they didn't do, lack of forgiveness. And it's as much forgiveness, not just of others, but self. And there's just, these are a few citations of resources that point this out. So that's it, since I just about ran overtime. But one of the things, there's 2 really last things I'd like to leave you with. One of which is that we've discovered that this is really a continuing issue. There are continuing lessons being learned. What we're doing now is not what we'll do in a couple of years from now. This is an evolving response to an evolving understanding of what's going on with people who come back with injuries, emotional, mental, and physical injuries. And the second piece, which is really kind of interesting, it all focuses on different expressions of stress, but they are incredibly different expressions. And it's something we just need to be able to articulate and work through and be able to respond to in effective ways to bring about healing. So the lessons are being learned, and that's one of the good things. And this is an evidence of the commitment that lessons are being learned and they're being translated into practical applications or responses. They're not just being left out there in the ether. And as we continue, we pray and believe that our care for the returning warrior in whatever condition will continue to improve, and that as part of this, our preparation for them will also improve so that we have a healthier group of folks coming and going. Thank you.